different for the beginning of this film tonight. I'm Patrick Welsh. I work here at Phoenix, and it's my great pleasure, very proud to welcome Chris Goldsmith tonight.
We have a bit more sound, please.
Should I shout a little loud? Does the microphone actually work? Okay, all right. Sorry, well, what I was trying to say was that we have a speaker tonight just to introduce the film for 10 minutes, and he is Chris Goldsmith, and he's the head of department for politics and public policy at De Montfort University. So we're very proud and pleased to have him come along and provide us with a little bit of context to this film. So Chris, his background is in international relations and diplomatic history, and he's got a particular interest in the Cold War era. He's always had an enduring interest in Russia and Soviet history, he tells me, so much so that he actually went to live and work in Siberia for a couple of years. So I give you, with no further ado, Chris. Welcome.
Move this down a little bit. Can anybody hear me at the back? Good.
Not very well.
Not very well. I'll try and speak up then. All right, I've had a bit of a chest infection the last few days, so I apologise if there's any coughing along the way. It's difficult thinking about what to say to you about this film because I came to see it the other day, and obviously I don't want to give away too much of the story, but I'll give you a bit of the background. Obviously, there we have him, the great man himself, or the great monster, depending on which way you want to look at him. If we think about him today, maybe he does seem like a bit of a historical monster lost in the mists of time. It's only 60 years, but it seems like a long time in many ways. But one could argue that his influence is still having an impact on our lives today. Yeah, we only have to look at the problems in North Korea, a regime that was supported and wouldn't exist without the support of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, to see that Stalin still has some effect. We can see in the revived aspirations of contemporary Russia, perhaps, some of the kind of legacy of Stalin. We may also see him as an archetype. He's that kind of charismatic leader with a cult of personality. Think Emmanuel Macron, maybe. Think, more to the point, Donald Trump. You might think, what kind of politics do these kinds of leaders inspire? What are the courts that surround them and the courtiers who play in them? How do they behave? And given my viewing of the film on Saturday, you'll get a lot of ideas from watching this movie. The picture we're looking at, of course, is the World War II Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, the heroic ally of Britain, the man who led his country from the dark days when Germany was on the outskirts of Moscow to victory in Berlin just 3 years later. And when Russians think about Stalin today, you often see quotes saying Stalin is the #1 famous Russian leader. If there was a Russian leader that Russians would like to have back, they would like to have back Stalin in polls. This is the context in which I believe they consider him as a man who led their country to victory in the most important conflict of the 20th century, of a man who established the Soviet Union as a superpower with nuclear weapons and with a defensive position in the centre of Europe. And furthermore, a man who had dragged the Soviet Union from a fundamentally peasant economy to a modern industrial one. So, of course, we know, and Russians know, that these achievements were achieved at great cost. That the huge infrastructure developments, the electrification of the Soviet Union, the industrialisation of the 1930s, as well as the victory of 1945, were built on the backs of millions of forced labourers imprisoned in the Gulag system of prison camps. Historians estimate that that's around 14 million people who were held in these camps in the years 1929 to 1953. It's the Stalin who not only operated that system, but also, after 1937, began a series of purges against his own party, that eliminated opponents and competitors alike. In the period 1937 to 1939, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, was killing around 1,000 people a day. Historians again can't estimate exactly how many people died in the 37 to 39 purge, but roughly estimated we look at around 1 million people. These stories are well known, and in fact in literature and in film they've been captured. The fear and paranoia, the endemic fear and paranoia that this series of events caused is captured very well in Julian Barnes's latest novel, The Noise of Time, where he has the picture of Shostakovich sat on his suitcase waiting for the NKVD men to come and collect him. Rather than having to wake his wife up in the middle of the night, Shostakovich chooses to sit out by the elevators on his suitcase waiting for the knock at the door. You might think at the end of the war, with Stalin supreme, that things would get more helpful, more hopeful. The people certainly believed that things might return to some kind of normality. But that would be to underestimate the man who we're looking at here. Stalin wanted to reimpose discipline. He thought that the war had been a period of kind of license for the Soviet people, and now we needed to get back to the serious business of making communism. How did that manifest itself? This was a man who was just over 70. He was ill. He suffered from cardiac disease. He may have had a minor stroke at the end of the war. His facilities were in decline. He mentioned retirement. It's pretty clear that he had no intention of retiring, but he did it in order to wind up all his potential successors. He wound them up to such a point that actually 3 of them died in the period between 1945 and 1950, because the rivals were all competing to frame each other. By this stage, he rarely gave direct orders. One of his advisors said, Stalin knows that if you throw a stone in a puddle, ripples will appear somewhere. So he was capricious, manipulative, and super sensitive of his own position. Anybody getting too much praise or rising up, he would cut down to size. He was constantly stoking up controversies in the group around him in order to keep them on their toes. So if you were one of his close courtiers, you had to learn how to handle him and survive his company, because at this time, and for much of his reign, Stalin's main way of keeping everybody together was to invite them to dinner. If you read Simon Sebag Montefiore's In the Court of the Red King or the Red Tsar, you will see loads of accounts of how Stalin would humiliate his close advisors at dinners that often started at 1 in the morning, and last until the early hours. So his courtiers would then have to go to work and run the country, having been sleep deprived. So he would make them dance with each other. He would make them drink huge amounts of alcohol, and then, suitably for where we are, he'd take them to the cinema. And going to see a film was a ritual that happened most nights at Stalin's, He would go downstairs to the cinema. The Minister of Film, Ivan Bolshakov, would be waiting outside the cinema. He'd have to look at Stalin coming down the corridor and guess what kind of mood he was in. If he was in a bad mood, you showed him one of the things that he really loved: Chaplin, gangster movies, westerns. If he was in a good mood, then you might show him the latest Soviet release, something that he hadn't seen before. If it was a foreign film, Bolshakov was had to give a kind of instant translation. So Bolshakov spent most of his days learning by rote translations of Stalin's extensive collection of foreign films so that he was able to translate them. And he would be mocked for any mistakes that he made on the way along. So given this checkered history, you might think, why did Russians like him? But yet there's huge amounts of propaganda. This one here says, Stalin in the Kremlin cares for all of us. Yeah. He was also portrayed not just as the father of the nation, but beloved of children, even though his own children, who you'll see in the film, he abandoned them to be raised by his staff after the death of his wife, or the suicide of his wife in 1932. His son Vasily once said that I've only got two choices, the pistol or the bottle. The pistol will cause lots of trouble for my father, so I choose the bottle. His daughter Svetlana wanted to study literature. He forced her to study politics. It's a bit like I feel when I'm at open days. Much loved by Stalin. He often wanted to marry her to one of the top people in the families of the top Bolshevik families, but she tended to go off and have inappropriate relationships, and he would then forgive her after about a year or so. And she's quite interesting because she ended up in Britain. She became a British citizen in the 1990s, and she lived in Bristol. So she's a survivor. So I thought I'd just give you some kind of quick character sketches of the main players. I kind of like this picture because it reminds me of sort of, On the Town. Here are the gang all together ready to rock Moscow. On the left, we've got the Minister of Labour, or Minister for Trade, Anastas Mikoyan. Mikoyan's best known for his kind of snappy dressing. And in the circle, he was always being mocked for how dapper he looked and how well dressed he was. By 1949, he had been very much part of the kind of in crowd, but Stalin had kind of gone off him, and even in 1952, he begins to actively attack him in party congresses, and it looks like Mikoyan's going to fall. Next to him with the hat, that's Nikita Khrushchev. He was, by 1950, the party boss in Moscow, but he had been party boss in the Ukraine. Probably his proudest moment up to this time was his role in the Second World War. He was at the Battle of Stalingrad as the kind of political commissar, trying to keep the Soviet side fighting. He was from a peasant background, and he was seen as a bit of a yokel at times. Even at age 60, Stalin made him do Russian folk dancing at dinner. So the Cossack dancing that you may have seen. And generally play tricks on him. Mikoyan used to like to put tomatoes in his pocket because he had all these snazzy suits, so putting a tomato in his pocket was quite funny. To the right of Stalin, you've got, in the sailor suit, you've got Georgy Malenkov. He was a guy who rose up through the party machine. He was kind of in charge of membership. So very useful in the purges to know who was a member and who wasn't, who was associated with who. He was a deputy party leader by 1950, crafty politician, played a very interesting role in kind of eliminating potential rivals in the late 1940s. He denounced General Zhukov for having lots of war booty in his home after World War II, and got Zhukov, who we'll see in a moment, demoted. And he also managed to get most of the Leningrad party leadership killed in 1948 and 49 with sort of made-up charges that they were kind of conspiring with foreign powers. Next to him, probably the villain of the piece, Lavrentiy Beria. He was the head of the secret police from 1939 to 1947 and still had his hand, even as a deputy prime minister, in the secret police business. He played a big role in the doctors' plot. Stalin didn't like doctors. When he found out that his doctors thought he should work less, he had them all killed for being Jewish conspirators and plotting to kill him. Yes, and actually Stalin and Beria trumped up some anti-Jewish campaigning in the early 50s. So Beria, as well as being responsible for large numbers of deaths through his kind of role in the secret police, loved torturing people. In his office was found lots of torture equipment, and he was a sexual predator. So he would drive around Moscow collecting up young athletic women, and that was one of the things that was held against him. Last but not least, Vyacheslav Molotov, long-term foreign minister, still at the top table by 1950, but Stalin had really kind of turned against him because he thought he was getting too much kind of press coverage in the West, where he was the kind of chief negotiator in kind of five-power talks. In December 1948, Beria and Stalin arrested Paulina, Molotov's wife, for treason. And he was unable, his power was in such kind of flux, he was in such a lacking influential position that his wife was sent to a labour camp for 5 years, convicted of treason. And she divorced him so that his record was not stained. But I suppose in some kind of a romantic way, he every time he ate at home, he made sure that the table was laid for two, even in the years when she was in prison. One of the good things about the death of Stalin is that she wasn't killed, she was reunited with him after Stalin's death. So, almost there. In the middle there, the man on the right is General Montgomery, and the man on the middle is General Zhukov, or Field Marshal Zhukov. And he comes into this film, but actually in real history, Zhukov only came back to prominence after Stalin's death. Zhukov obviously was the leading general of the Soviet Union, and the victor in Berlin in 1945. And his relationship with Stalin was very tricky. In some ways, Stalin liked him because he was a very blunt-speaking man. If he disagreed with Stalin, he'd tell him. Yeah, unlike all the other courtiers who were kind of fawning around him, Zhukov said what he thought. Of course, once the war was over, Stalin saw him as a rival and not somebody who he wants. And eventually, Malenkov trumps up these, made the most of these opportunities to cause Zhukov's downfall, and Zhukov is sent off to Odessa to look after the Odessa military district. And it's only in 1953 that Zhukov comes back to the picture and becomes part of the Soviet leadership again. So, this moment, the lying in state of Joseph Stalin, is at the heart of this film. It was an amazing moment for the Soviet Union. It was an amazing moment for the world. It might have been, there's some discussion amongst historians, whether this was a missed opportunity for potential peace in the Cold War. Yeah, so there would have been no Vietnam War if the great powers could have taken the moment that was allowed when the Soviet leadership was very open and in flux to talk peace. But in fact, the United States, to some extent, didn't want to talk peace in 1953. It wanted to maintain the Cold War. So, as we look at pictures of Stalin lying in his funeral arrangements, I'll leave you to enjoy the film. I hope you have a great time, and it's a really interesting watch. Thank you.